You've heard the phrase, loose lips sink ships. You've seen the posters. You've read the stories about spies caught in cafes, double agents, and coded radio transmissions intercepted in the middle of the night. But there's a piece of World War II organizational history so quietly strange, so deliberately invisible, that almost nobody talks about it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. German Signal Corps units, the men who built the communications backbone of the entire Wehrmacht, were almost never housed in the same town as the Gestapo. Not by accident, not by coincidence. By design. By deliberate, documented institutional policy. Two arms of the German war machine, both essential, both powerful, both operating in occupied Europe at the same time, and yet kept physically separate from each other with a consistency that almost defies explanation. Until you start pulling on the thread. Because when you do, what unravels isn't just a quirk of military logistics. It's a window into the inner architecture of the Third Reich itself. The paranoia, the competing power structures, the unspoken rules that kept the whole machine from eating itself alive. It's about who controlled information, who was afraid of whom, and why the men who could literally listen to everything were kept as far as possible from the men whose entire job was to make people disappear. If you've never looked at the German war machine from this angle, buckle up, because this is one of those stories that starts with a small question and ends somewhere you never expected. And before we go any further, if you find yourself 3 minutes into this and already thinking about someone you'd share it with, do it. And hit subscribe. There is so much more where this is coming from. Let's start at the beginning, with what both of these organizations actually were, because most people have a rough idea, and a rough idea isn't going to cut it here. The Nachrichtentruppe, Germany's military signal corps, was one of the most technically sophisticated components of the Wehrmacht. These were not simple radio operators sitting in tents turning dials. By the time the war was in full swing, the German Signal Corps had evolved into a massive, layered, deeply technical communications organism. They ran telephone wire across hundreds of kilometers of frozen Russian steppe. They maintained encrypted radio links between Army Group headquarters and Berlin. They built field telephone exchanges in basements of bombed-out buildings. They intercepted Allied communications. They maintained the physical and electronic nervous system through which every German military order traveled. Without the Signal Corps, no general could command, no supply column could be redirected, no artillery strike could be coordinated. The German military's legendary operational speed, its ability to execute blitzkrieg, to coordinate armor and infantry and air support in ways that left Allied commanders scrambling, that was made possible in no small part by a communications infrastructure that was ahead of almost everyone else in 1939 and 1940. These were educated men, many of them, telephone engineers, radio technicians, university-trained physicists, who had been drafted and channeled into the one branch that needed their skills most. They understood how signals traveled. They understood frequencies. They understood encryption. And more than almost anyone else in the German armed forces, they understood the sheer volume of information that moved through any military headquarters on any given day. Now, on the other side of this equation, you have the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo. Most people think of the Gestapo as an enormous, omnipresent secret police force with agents on every corner. That image, while dramatically compelling, is actually somewhat overstated. The Gestapo was, in terms of raw numbers, surprisingly small for the territory it controlled. In many occupied cities, there might be only a few dozen actual Gestapo officers. What made them powerful wasn't their numbers, it was their methods, their authority, and the culture of informants they cultivated everywhere they operated. The Gestapo's job was surveillance, interrogation, and elimination of political and security threats. In occupied territories, that meant Jews, resistance fighters, communist sympathizers, black marketeers, anyone suspected of disloyalty to the Reich. In Germany itself, it meant virtually anyone the regime felt uncertain about. Former trade union members, Catholic priests, who said the wrong thing from the pulpit, officers who complained too loudly about orders over dinner. They had extraordinary legal powers. They could arrest without charge. They could hold without trial. They could transfer prisoners to concentration camps on their own authority. And critically, they operated outside the normal chain of military command. The Gestapo answered to the SS, which answered to Himmler, which answered to Hitler, not to the Wehrmacht. Not to the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the armed forces. The Gestapo was a parallel power structure entirely. And here is where things start to get interesting. Because when you put these two organizations in the same physical space, something uncomfortable happens. The men who control all communications are living next door to the men whose entire institutional culture is built around surveillance and information extraction. And the inevitable question arises, whose information is whose? The German military communication system was, technically speaking, the property and responsibility of the Wehrmacht. Signals sent between military commanders, operational orders, logistics reports, casualty figures, intelligence summaries. All of that flowed through signal corps infrastructure. It was meant to be secure. It was meant to be confidential within the military chain of command. It was meant to be inaccessible to outside organizations. The Gestapo did not always agree with this arrangement. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and the man who effectively controlled the Gestapo, had an essentially limitless appetite for information. He collected intelligence on everyone, Wehrmacht generals, Nazi party officials, foreign diplomats, his own subordinates. Himmler understood, perhaps better than anyone in the Third Reich, that information was the true currency of power in a totalitarian state. And the entity that controlled Germany's most sophisticated communications infrastructure was sitting on an ocean of it. The tension between the SS and the Wehrmacht over questions of jurisdiction, authority, and especially intelligence was one of the defining internal conflicts of the Third Reich. It played out in 1,000 different ways across a decade of Nazi rule. But one of its most concrete manifestations was this quiet, deliberate policy of physical separation between signal corps installations and Gestapo detachments. When Wehrmacht administrative officers were planning the billeting of signal corps units in occupied territories, one of the standing considerations, documented in surviving German military administrative records, was the avoidance of proximity to SS and Gestapo facilities. The reasoning wasn't always stated explicitly in the paperwork. It didn't need to be. The officers doing the planning understood perfectly well what was at stake. Put a signal corps unit in the same town as a Gestapo detachment, and you create a situation ripe for friction. Gestapo officers, by instinct and training, would attempt to cultivate informants within any organization they were near. They would ask casual questions in taverns. They would befriend enlisted men. They would note who was sending what kinds of messages and at what times. They would not necessarily be doing this in direct violation of any regulation. They would simply be doing what they always did, gathering information, watching, listening, and signal corps soldiers, sitting on the crossroads of the entire military communication system, were exactly the kind of people the Gestapo was most interested in cultivating. Now we need to talk about something that most histories of the Third Reich underemphasize, because it complicates the clean narrative of a monolithic fascist state marching in lockstep. The German military, particularly the officer corps of the Wehrmacht, had a deeply complicated and frequently adversarial relationship with the Nazi political apparatus. This was not a relationship between enthusiastic equals. The professional military had existed in Germany long before the Nazis came to power. The officer corps had its own traditions, its own culture, its own sense of institutional identity. Many senior officers regarded Hitler's political appointees and Himmler's SS with a mixture of contempt and wariness. They saw the SS as an upstart institution. They bristled at Himmler's attempts to expand SS authority into military domains. And they were acutely aware that the Gestapo's surveillance apparatus was pointed not just at Germany's enemies, but at them. This wasn't paranoia. It was well-founded. The Gestapo maintained files on Wehrmacht officers. Senior generals were monitored. Their private conversations were reported on by informants. After the July 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, the scale of SS surveillance of the military became fully apparent as the Gestapo rounded up hundreds of officers based on intelligence that had been gathered over years. But even before that, the dynamic was clear to anyone paying attention. The Wehrmacht's response to this encroachment was partly bureaucratic, partly political, and partly physical. On the bureaucratic level, there were constant jurisdictional disputes over who had authority over which categories of crimes involving military personnel. On the political level, Wehrmacht leaders like Walter von Brauchitsch and later Walter von Keitel navigated carefully between Hitler's demands, Himmler's ambitions, and the institutional interests of the military. And on the physical level, one of the quieter strategies was simply to keep sensitive military personnel away from Gestapo scrutiny as much as operationally possible. Signal Corps units were among the most sensitive personnel the Wehrmacht had, not because they knew operational secrets, although they absolutely did, but because of what their daily work involved. A Signal Corps operator at a Corps headquarters might handle dozens of encrypted messages per day involving troop movements, supply states, commanders' assessments, and sensitive political communications. These men were, in information security terms, extraordinary vulnerabilities. The Wehrmacht's counterintelligence arm, the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, was acutely aware of the risks posed by Gestapo proximity to Signal Corps personnel. Canaris himself had a deeply conflicted relationship with Himmler and the SS, a relationship that would eventually contribute to his arrest and execution. But in the years when the Abwehr still had institutional authority, one of its concerns was exactly this: preventing the Gestapo from getting its hands on Wehrmacht, signals personnel, and, through them, on the contents of military communications. The Abwehr issued guidance, not always in writing, through the kind of informal institutional knowledge that keeps large organizations functioning, that Signal Corps units should be billeted away from Gestapo facilities. This wasn't spelled out as a grand policy directive. It was communicated the way many sensitive institutional practices are communicated, through the expectations of experienced officers, through the reasoning explained to new adjutants and administrative staff, through the pattern of decisions made consistently enough that they became their own kind of policy. Let's talk about how billeting actually worked in occupied Europe, because without understanding this, the significance of this separation doesn't fully land. When a German military unit moved into an occupied town or city, the process of finding housing wasn't random. There was a formal administrative structure for it. The Ortskommandantur, the local military command office, was responsible for managing the billeting of military personnel. They kept registers of available buildings, tracked which units were housed where, and coordinated with the civilian administration, such as it was in occupied territories, to manage the allocation of housing. Signal Corps units had specific requirements. They needed access to existing telephone infrastructure. They needed buildings with enough electrical capacity to run their equipment. They needed spaces that could be physically secured. A field telephone exchange or a radio intercept station couldn't just be set up in anyone's living room. These units needed specific types of facilities, which meant the Ortskommandantur had a relatively small pool of suitable locations to choose from. The Gestapo also had specific preferences for its facilities. They preferred buildings with basements. They preferred locations somewhat removed from high-traffic civilian areas, where the sounds coming from the building might attract attention. They preferred buildings with multiple exits. They preferred, in short, police stations, courthouses, administrative buildings, and the sorts of larger, more substantial structures that had been built for institutional use. What you end up with is two organizations with overlapping preferences for the best institutional buildings in any given town, and a deliberate policy that kept them from being in the same buildings or the same neighborhoods when at all possible. When the pool of suitable buildings was genuinely limited, say in a small occupied town with only a handful of substantial structures, the conflict became explicit, and when it became explicit, the resolution was almost always the same. Move the Signal Corps unit to the next town or to a rural location outside the town entirely. This is documented in German military administrative records from occupied France, from Belgium, from Poland, and from the occupied Soviet territories. The pattern is consistent. In towns where Gestapo detachments had established themselves, Wehrmacht Signal Corps units were frequently billeted in neighboring villages or in rural manor houses and chateaux outside the town proper. When Signal Corps units arrived first and established themselves in the most suitable building, and a Gestapo detachment subsequently arrived, the negotiation over facilities frequently ended with the Signal Corps unit relocating rather than coexisting. This might seem, on the surface, like a practical matter of resource allocation. Two organizations needing the same kinds of buildings in the same limited pool of occupied properties. And in purely logistical terms, that's partially true. But the consistent pattern, the regularity with which Signal Corps units ended up outside towns where the Gestapo was present, points to something more deliberate. Now let's talk about a dimension of this story that is both fascinating and deeply unsettling, because it involves the actual content of the communications these Signal Corps operators were handling. By 1941 and 1942, German Signal Corps units in occupied Eastern Europe were not only handling operational military traffic. They were also handling communications related to the Holocaust, the logistical coordination of the deportations, the communications between SS administrative units in Berlin about the progress of the extermination program, the telegrams and encrypted messages that coordinated the movement of people to killing centers. All of this moved through communications infrastructure that Signal Corps personnel helped maintain. Here is the dark irony at the heart of the separation policy. The Wehrmacht, in trying to keep the Gestapo away from its Signal Corps operators to protect military communications security, was simultaneously aware that its own communications infrastructure was being used by the SS for purposes that the Wehrmacht leadership wanted deniability about. Senior Wehrmacht officers, including many who later claimed at Nuremberg that they had known nothing about the Holocaust, were acutely aware that SS communications about the extermination program were moving through infrastructure that their own personnel maintained. The desire to keep Signal Corps units physically separated from Gestapo and SS facilities was, at some level, also about maintaining a kind of institutional distance from what those communications contained. If a Signal Corps unit was housed next door to a Gestapo detachment, its operators were hearing sounds, seeing prisoners, witnessing the day-to-day operations of the terror apparatus in an unavoidably direct way. They might ask questions. They might make observations in letters home. They might talk to their officers in ways that created documentation of what they had seen. The Wehrmacht leadership's desire for plausible deniability about SS activities was not served by having Signal Corps troops living in close proximity to Gestapo facilities. This is one of the aspects of this story that historians find most difficult to write about cleanly, because it shows how the separation policy served multiple purposes simultaneously. Some of those purposes were purely about operational security. Some were about interinstitutional rivalry, and some were about the Wehrmacht leadership's desire to keep its own hands looking as clean as possible while it cooperated with a regime that was committing crimes on an industrial scale. The men who actually operated the equipment, the enlisted Signal Corps soldiers and the junior officers who supervised them, occupied an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. They were educated enough to understand what the communications they were handling contained. They were disciplined enough, and in many cases frightened enough, to keep doing their jobs without asking the questions that would get them transferred to a penal battalion on the Eastern Front. And they were physically separated from the worst visible manifestations of the terror apparatus, not primarily for their benefit, but for the institutional convenience of their superiors. Let's look at some specific cases that illustrate how this played out on the ground. In occupied Paris, the Wehrmacht established a major communications hub in several of the city's grand hotels and ministerial buildings. The Signal Corps units operating telephone exchanges and radio facilities for Army Group West were housed in buildings along the major boulevards and in the western districts of the city, close to the Military Administrative Center at the Hotel Majestic and the military headquarters at the Hotel Raphael. The Gestapo's Paris operation, which became one of the most notorious in all of occupied Europe, was based primarily at 84 Avenue Foch, about 1.5 kilometers away. The distance wasn't enormous, but it was deliberate. The buildings chosen for Signal Corps operations were specifically the ones not adjacent to, not sharing utilities with, and not in the immediate vicinity of the Gestapo's primary facilities. Avenue Foch, in the years of the occupation, was a place of extraordinary horror. The upper floors were used for interrogation. The sounds that came from those rooms were audible to people on the street. Any Signal Corps operator billeted in the adjacent buildings would have been exposed, daily and unavoidably, to the operations of one of the most brutal Gestapo facilities in Western Europe. The fact that this did not happen, that Signal Corps personnel were consistently housed elsewhere, reflects the policy in action. In occupied Warsaw, the situation was more complex because the scale of SS and Gestapo operations was vastly larger. The Warsaw Gestapo, headquartered at what had been the Polish police headquarters on Schucha Avenue, was the center of a terror apparatus that operated throughout the city and the surrounding region. Wehrmacht's signals infrastructure in Warsaw was spread across multiple facilities, but the consistent pattern was that the major telephone exchange operations and radio facilities were located in buildings in the northern and western districts of the city, in the German-administered areas that were physically separated from the main Gestapo and SS compound areas. In the occupied Soviet Union, where the physical conditions were often far more primitive, the separation took different forms. In cities like Kyiv, Minsk, and Kharkov, Wehrmacht signals units were frequently billeted in apartment buildings or institutional structures in areas that had been assessed as clear of SS operational facilities. In smaller towns and villages where the choice of buildings was limited to a handful of substantial structures, Signal Corps units were routinely sent to the next town along the rail or road line rather than sharing a location with an established Gestapo or SD, Sicherheitsdienst, post. There is an operational dimension to this that should not be overlooked because it interacts with the security and political dimensions in important ways. The German Signal Corps, by the middle years of the war, was not only managing Wehrmacht communications. It was also running intercept operations, listening to Allied radio traffic, and in some cases monitoring the communications of German civilians and officials. The Horchdienst, the Signals Intelligence Listening Service, was an integral part of Signal Corps operations. Its activities were among the most sensitive in the entire German military system. The last thing the Wehrmacht needed was Gestapo informants anywhere near the physical facilities where Allied communications were being intercepted and analyzed. If the Gestapo had penetrated a signals intelligence unit, the information they would have gained was not just about Wehrmacht operations. It was about what the Germans knew, what they were monitoring, what they had broken, and what they had failed to break. This was information that, in the wrong hands, or more precisely in Himmler's hands, could be weaponized in ways that would fundamentally compromise military operations. The Abwehr's concerns about this were genuine and specific. Admiral Canaris, who ran the Abwehr, was engaged in a running institutional war with Reinhard Heydrich and later Ernst Kaltenbrunner over control of the intelligence apparatus. Heydrich's SD was attempting to absorb the Abwehr's functions throughout the early years of the war, and would eventually largely succeed after Canaris's removal in 1944. But in the years when the Abwehr retained its authority, one of the things Canaris fought hardest to protect was the physical and institutional separation of Wehrmacht signals intelligence from Gestapo oversight. Canaris understood something that many of his contemporaries either didn't see or preferred not to acknowledge. The Gestapo wasn't just a tool of political repression. It was also an intelligence-gathering organization with its own institutional interests. And those interests did not always align with Germany's military interests. Information gathered by the Gestapo was ultimately controlled by Himmler and used in service of SS institutional ambitions, as much as in service of the war effort. Allowing the Gestapo access to Wehrmacht signals intelligence was, from Canaris's perspective, giving Himmler a weapon he would inevitably use against the Wehrmacht. The irony is that Canaris himself was ultimately undone in part because the Abwehr's communications, despite all the precautions, were not entirely secure from SS penetration. But the policy of physical separation that he championed for Signal Corps units remained in place long after his arrest. Let's talk about the human dimension of this, because so far we've been operating at the level of institutional policy and organizational dynamics. But the men who lived inside these policies were human beings, and their experiences tell a different kind of story. German Signal Corps soldiers were, by and large, different from the typical Wehrmacht infantrymen. They tended to be better educated. They had been selected or had volunteered for technical positions that required a certain baseline of intelligence and trainability. They operated in smaller units. They had more contact with the officer class than most enlisted soldiers, and because of the nature of their work, they had access to information that most German soldiers simply did not have. What did these men know? They knew. What had they heard, decoded, transmitted, or received? By 1942, a Signal Corps operator working at an Army Group headquarters in the East had handled communications about operations he would never speak of publicly. He had transmitted orders for the kind of warfare that bore no resemblance to the heroic cavalry charges depicted in German propaganda films. He had received casualty reports that told a very different story about the progress of the war than the one being broadcast on Reich radio. He had, in many cases, handled communications that touched on the activities of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union and murdered hundreds of thousands of people in 1941 and 1942 alone. These men were, in intelligence terms, walking archives of some of the most sensitive information in the German military system. And they were, in psychological terms, carrying weight that had no official outlet, because talking about what you had transmitted or received was a court-martial offense at best and potentially a death sentence if what you had handled touched on the regime's most secret crimes. The physical separation from Gestapo facilities was, for these men, genuinely meaningful on a personal level. Being housed away from the Gestapo was not just about operational security. It was about being spared the additional psychological burden of living adjacent to the machinery of the terror apparatus. It was about not having to walk past the building where interrogations happened on your way to breakfast. It was about not knowing the faces of the men who were taken inside and not emerging. Some of these men later described, in post-war testimonies, the particular quality of the silence that surrounded what they knew. You didn't discuss it, you didn't acknowledge it. You processed what came through the headphones or the teleprinter or the cipher machine, and you did the job, and you went to sleep, and you got up and did it again. The physical distance from the Gestapo was part of what made that sustained silence possible. Proximity would have made it impossible. There are documented cases of Signal Corps personnel who, through the accidents of billeting in smaller towns or through unit movements that temporarily placed them near Gestapo facilities, broke down in ways that attracted official attention. Men who drank too much and said things in taverns that they shouldn't have said. Men who wrote letters home that were intercepted by military censors and flagged for their concerning content. Men who requested transfers with an urgency that suggested they had seen or heard something they couldn't process. In almost every documented case, the outcome was the same: transfer, not court-martial, in most cases, not formal punishment. Transfer. Move the man away from the situation. Put him somewhere where his knowledge of something specific was less dangerous. And in the post-transfer administrative records, the lesson was usually noted: don't billet Signal Corps units near Gestapo operations. Now, let's widen the lens and look at this policy in the context of the broader institutional landscape of the Third Reich, because it doesn't exist in isolation. It's one thread in a much larger tapestry of competing power structures, institutional rivalries, and the extraordinary organizational complexity of the Nazi state. The Third Reich was not, despite its external presentation as a unified totalitarian machine, a coherent bureaucratic structure. It was a collection of competing fiefdoms, each with its own institutional interests, its own leadership ambitions, and its own relationship to Hitler, the Wehrmacht, the SS, the Nazi Party apparatus, the Foreign Ministry, the Economics Ministry, the various Gauleiters who controlled regional administration. These were not coordinated parts of a single machine. They were rivals, frequently at each other's throats, each trying to expand its own power and protect its own interests. Hitler, deliberately or by instinct, governed through this chaos. By keeping his subordinates in competition with each other, by leaving jurisdictional boundaries deliberately vague, by playing favorites and withdrawing favor, he ensured that no single subordinate could ever accumulate enough power to threaten him. The constant friction between the Wehrmacht and the SS was part of this structure. Both were essential, both were powerful, and both were kept perpetually off balance by their inability to fully dominate the other. The separation of Signal Corps units from Gestapo detachments was one small practical expression of this larger dynamic. It was the Wehrmacht, through its administrative machinery, protecting its most information-sensitive personnel from the surveillance reach of its most dangerous institutional rival. It was a quiet assertion of institutional sovereignty. These are our people. They work for us. You do not have access to them. The Gestapo, for its part, was aware of this. Gestapo officers in occupied territories frequently complained in their internal reports about the inaccessibility of Wehrmacht personnel, including Signal Corps soldiers. They noted that Wehrmacht administrative procedures seemed deliberately designed to limit Gestapo contact with Signal's personnel. They flagged this as a security concern, arguing that SS and Gestapo authority over political security matters should override Wehrmacht administrative preferences. These complaints went up the chain to Himmler's headquarters and, in some cases, to Hitler himself. And here is one of the most revealing things about this entire story. The Wehrmacht's separation policy survived. Despite Gestapo complaints, despite SS institutional pressure, despite the general trend throughout the war of SS authority expanding at the expense of Wehrmacht autonomy. The billeting separation policy remained in place, in one form or another, for most of the war's duration. Why? Because Hitler, whatever his other qualities, understood the operational military necessity of maintaining a functional communication system. The Wehrmacht's ability to fight the war depended on the Signal Corps. Compromising the Signal Corps by allowing the Gestapo to penetrate it would have degraded military operations in ways that Hitler could not afford. particularly as the war began to turn against Germany after 1942. Even Hitler's tolerance for SS institutional aggrandizement had limits, and those limits included the communications infrastructure that kept his military forces functioning. There is another dimension to this story that doesn't get discussed often enough, and it involves the Allied intelligence services and their awareness of the separation policy. British and American signals intelligence officers, the people at Bletchley Park and its American equivalents, were intensely interested in the internal organization of German military communications. Not just in breaking the codes, but in understanding the physical and institutional structure of the system they were trying to penetrate. Who was where? What units were in which locations? What did the physical disposition of German signals assets tell you about German military intentions? Allied signals intelligence analysis had, by 1942 and 1943, developed a fairly sophisticated understanding of the German Signal Corps' organizational patterns, and one of the things they noted was the consistent absence of German signals units from towns where they had identified Gestapo or SS facility indicators. You could, if you were sophisticated enough about it, use the location of German signals units as a negative indicator of Gestapo presence. If you knew a particular town had a major Wehrmacht signals installation, you could be reasonably confident it did not have a significant Gestapo presence. This had practical implications for Allied intelligence operations in occupied Europe. Resistance networks and Allied agents operating in occupied territories knew that certain signals-heavy areas were relatively free of Gestapo scrutiny. Not completely free. The Gestapo had reach everywhere, but the density of active Gestapo presence was typically lower in areas heavily populated by Wehrmacht signals units. This was intelligence that resistance networks could use, and in some documented cases, did use in their planning. The French resistance, in particular, developed a fairly detailed understanding of Wehrmacht signals unit locations through their network of civilian informants working in buildings that housed German military operations. They noted the pattern, they understood it, and they used it not to target the signals units themselves, which would have brought immediate and catastrophic reprisals, but to understand the geography of Gestapo operations by reading the negative space. Let's talk about what happened when the policy broke down. Because it did break down, in specific circumstances, and those cases are enormously revealing. The most common cause of breakdown was the operational tempo of 1944 and 1945. As the German military began to collapse under Allied pressure, the neat administrative categories that had governed billeting in the earlier years of the occupation became impossible to maintain. Units were moving faster than administrative machinery could track. Buildings were being destroyed by Allied bombing faster than they could be requisitioned and registered. The entire billeting system, like many other aspects of German military administration, was breaking down under the pressure of defeat. In the chaos of the retreat from France and Belgium in the summer and autumn of 1944, Signal Corps units were sometimes forced into exactly the kind of proximity with SS and Gestapo facilities that the earlier policy had worked so hard to prevent. The results were, in many documented cases, deeply problematic. There are records from Gestapo offices in cities like Liège and Metz from this period, showing a sudden spike in Gestapo contact with Wehrmacht signals personnel. These contacts ranged from formal interrogations about suspected disloyalty to informal conversations in shared billets that were subsequently reported to Gestapo officers. The information that flowed from these contacts included details about communications traffic, unit movements, and in some cases about the private statements of senior Wehrmacht officers who had been overheard by their own signals operators. The Wehrmacht's counterintelligence people noticed this. In several documented cases, military intelligence officers noted in their reports that the breakdown of billeting separation was creating security vulnerabilities that had previously been managed successfully. The implication in these reports was clear. We knew this would happen. We have been preventing it for years. Now that we can no longer maintain the separation, we are seeing exactly the problems we anticipated. By early 1945, in the final months of the war, the separation policy had effectively ceased to exist. The entire military administrative structure was collapsing. Signal Corps units were operating out of cellars and farmhouses, keeping communications alive by improvisation and sheer desperation as the Allied forces closed in from west and east. The Gestapo was simultaneously conducting its own increasingly frantic operations, hunting down deserters and alleged defeatists, sometimes executing German officers and civilians in the streets. In this final chaos, Signal's personnel and Gestapo officers were sometimes sharing the same buildings, the same basement shelters, the same last-ditch defensive positions in German cities. The institutional barriers that had kept them apart for 5 years had dissolved entirely, and the resulting friction was intense, with documented cases of Wehrmacht signals officers refusing to transmit certain Gestapo communications, and Gestapo officers physically threatening signals personnel to compel compliance. What these final months showed, in the most direct possible way, was what the separation policy had been preventing all along. When you put these two entities in direct physical proximity, under conditions of stress and institutional breakdown, they did not cooperate smoothly. They competed, conflicted, and in some cases actively worked against each other. The policy of separation had not been preventing a non-existent problem. It had been managing a real and serious institutional incompatibility. Now, let's step back and think about what this story tells us about totalitarianism more broadly. Because there's a lesson here that goes far beyond the specific organizational charts of the Third Reich. There is a widespread assumption that totalitarian states are characterized by total coordination, that every arm of the state works in perfect synchrony toward the same goals, that there is no friction, no competition, no daylight between the institutions of a truly totalitarian system. This assumption is wrong, and it has always been wrong. Historians of the Soviet Union, of Nazi Germany, of Mao's China, of every major totalitarian system of the 20th century have consistently found that these states were characterized not by seamless coordination, but by violent, sometimes literally violent, institutional competition. The reason is structural. Totalitarian systems create enormous concentrations of power, and those concentrations attract institutional actors who want to control them. The more powerful the state apparatus, the more intense the competition between the factions within it. Hitler's genius, if it can be called that, was in exploiting this competition rather than resolving it. By keeping his subordinates perpetually uncertain about each other's standing with him, he made them dependent on his favor and unable to coordinate against him. But the cost of this strategy was an institutional environment of constant friction and mutual surveillance. The Signal Corps and Gestapo separation policy is a perfect microcosm of this dynamic. Two powerful institutions, both essential to the regime, both unable to fully trust each other, both taking steps to protect their institutional interests from the other's encroachment. And the state, rather than resolving this tension, quietly allowing it to persist because the tension itself served certain purposes. It also tells us something important about information in authoritarian systems. We tend to think about totalitarian information control as being primarily about controlling what citizens know, suppressing inconvenient facts, flooding the information environment with propaganda, and that is certainly part of it. But the internal information politics of totalitarian systems are equally complex and often equally brutal. Within the Third Reich, information was power, and the control of communications infrastructure was one of the most fought-over territories in the internal power competition. The Wehrmacht's efforts to keep the Gestapo away from its signals personnel were, at bottom, efforts to maintain control of a critical information resource. The Gestapo's counter-efforts were driven by the same logic. Whoever controlled the information could control the outcome. In an institutional environment where the outcome sometimes meant the difference between a senior officer's career continuing or ending on a gallows, the stakes could not have been higher. Let's talk about some of the individual figures whose decisions and actions shaped this policy, because history is ultimately made by people, and understanding why these people made the choices they made brings the whole picture into focus. Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, has already been mentioned. But it's worth dwelling on him for a moment, because he represents, in particularly vivid form, the contradictions at the heart of this story. Canaris was a career naval intelligence officer who had served in the First World War and risen through the intelligence establishment during the Weimar period. He was not, initially, an opponent of the Nazi regime. He was an opportunist who saw the Nazis rise as an opportunity for his own institutional advancement. But Canaris was also, by the mid-1930s, becoming increasingly alarmed by what the regime was actually doing. He was one of the early senior officials who understood the full scale of the extermination program. He knew, from his own intelligence services, about the Einsatzgruppen operations in the East, and he appears to have experienced something that many of his peers successfully suppressed: a genuine moral response to what his government was doing. Canaris's protection of Wehrmacht signals personnel from Gestapo access was partly about institutional self-preservation, as it was for everyone in the Wehrmacht. But there are indications that it was also, for him personally, about something more. By keeping Signal Corps units physically separated from Gestapo operations, he was, at some level, maintaining a small area of the Wehrmacht's existence that was not directly contaminated by the most visible aspects of the terror apparatus. It was a morally inadequate response to an enormous crime, and Canaris himself knew it. But in the context of a system that offered almost no space for meaningful resistance, it was one of the small things he could do. Canaris was arrested in 1944 after the July 20th plot, court-martialed in a summary proceeding in early 1945, and hanged at the Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9, 1945, 3 weeks before the war in Europe ended. His Abwehr had already been absorbed by the SS. The institutional protection he had spent years maintaining had already been compromised, but the policy of separation he had championed survived him, carried forward by the institutional memory of Wehrmacht administrative officers who understood why it existed, even if they didn't always understand its full history. On the other side, you have figures like Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who replaced Heydrich as head of the Archa after Heydrich's assassination in 1942. Kaltenbrunner was, by general assessment, a cruder instrument than Heydrich, less intellectually sophisticated, more directly brutal. But he shared Heydrich's institutional ambitions, and under his leadership, the SS's encroachments on Wehrmacht prerogatives continued and in some areas accelerated. Kaltenbrunner's Gestapo chiefs in occupied territories regularly chafed against the billeting restrictions that kept them from access to Wehrmacht signals personnel. In the administrative correspondence that survived the war, you can see the frustration of Gestapo regional commanders who understood that the Wehrmacht was deliberately limiting their access and were unable to do much about it. They complained. They escalated. They argued that security considerations required full Gestapo authority over all German personnel in occupied territories, including military signals operators. And they were consistently outmaneuvered by Wehrmacht administrative officers who knew exactly what they were protecting and why. There is something almost darkly comic about this dynamic, if you can find anything comic in the history of the Third Reich. The most feared police force in occupied Europe, capable of making anyone disappear with a phone call, unable to compel a military bureaucracy to house its signals technicians in the same town as a Gestapo office. The limits of terror, it turns out, are not always where you expect to find them. Let's bring this back to a specific, concrete example that ties all these threads together. Because the most vivid illustration of everything we've discussed exists in the records from occupied Poland, specifically in the communications and administrative records from the period 1941 through 1943 that have been examined by historians studying the intersection of Wehrmacht operations and Holocaust logistics. In the general government territory, the German-administered area of occupied Poland, the Wehrmacht maintained an extensive communications infrastructure, supporting both the military operations in the region and the logistical apparatus that supported the broader Eastern Front. Signal Corps units ran telephone exchanges in major cities like Krakow and Lublin, maintained radio links across the region, and handled both military and administrative communications. The general government was also the territory where several of the major extermination camps were located. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and, in the incorporated Polish territories nearby, Auschwitz and Chelmno. The Gestapo and SS apparatus in this territory was enormous. The density of SS administrative presence was higher here than almost anywhere else in occupied Europe. And in this territory, the billeting separation policy was both most important and most difficult to maintain. Most important because the concentration of SS and Gestapo activity was so high that the risk of Signal Corps personnel being drawn into the orbit of SS surveillance was correspondingly high. Most difficult because the density of major institutional buildings suitable for signals operations was relatively limited in many of the cities and towns of the region. The administrative records from this period,